What's up, guys? Welcome to Stronger TV. I'm Kiefer Lammy here with Dan Pope, and today we're going over overhead mobility. All right, so I think you and I were having a conversation about this the other day, and what we kind of found is that a lot of people are limited overhead, but I think almost across the board, everybody thinks it's a mobility issue. So they'll grab a band or they'll grab onto a rig or a pole or something. They're trying to crank themselves into excessive positions without actually knowing what might be limiting them. So when we were having this talk, I think you have a good way of kind of fleshing out whether or not at a baseline level it might be more mobility or more strength. So I wanted you to kind of take us through the screen, and then we'll break out and we'll talk about, how we can work on these things.
You got it. I think a really important concept to understand is that sometimes people don't use their full range of motion because they're not strong in that position, okay? So if I got to press a whole lot of weight overhead, sometimes my body's a little bit stronger in this position than it is fully stacked overhead. When you're taking a joint through its end range of motion, generally the muscles are stretched out, things are stretched in general, and the joint's not quite as strong, so your body doesn't really want to go there. Okay, so if you have an athlete that's limited with their overhead position, right? So maybe they're not jerking appropriately, or they have a bit of an arch when they finish pressing overhead. We want to figure out first and foremost, are we actually dealing with the mobility issue before we go ahead and start cranking on shoulders?
Cool.
What do you think, man?
Yeah, so let's show them the screen.
All right, so this is my favorite screen right here. We kind of came up with this with Dave Tilley for Power Monkey Fitness Camp. We're going to have Kiefer sit against the wall, cross leg. Good, and get as close as you can to the wall. A little tough to see from this angle, guys. The reason why we sit and cross the legs is because that forces the lower back flat against the wall. When individuals press overhead and they're limited overhead, a lot of times they'll extend from the lower back. So people can cheat in the same way on a screen than they would overhead, and want to make sure that we get the back flat to the wall by sitting, okay? Next thing we do is we take the hands and we just go thumbs together. Good. We're gonna have the arms as straight as we can get them, and from here, Kiefer's gonna try to touch his entire arm flat up against the wall.
Oh man, that's hard.
Yeah, so it's a little tough to see from this position, but he's missing a little bit of range of motion, okay? Now this is a very strict test. The thing is, we're trying to get our athletes into position for things like overhead squats, positions where we're getting a lot of flexion at the shoulder. So I like to make this nice and strict. You're not gonna find a lot of people that nail this perfectly, all right? But a couple things we're looking for. Does the back stay flat against the wall? Okay, check. I think the Kiefer did a good job with that. Go ahead and bring those arms all the way up. So he's missing a little bit of space, okay? There's maybe about this much space between his elbow and the wall and also the hand in the wall. The other thing that Kiefer's doing a good job of is keeping his arms straight. A lot of people will bend. Can you kind of show me that one right there? Good. And you actually see this compensation a little bit. Sometimes on the backswing of kips with rings, people will bend their elbows because they don't have as much range of motion here, all right? So missing a little bit of motion there, so it might be useful for you to gain that motion if you're trying to utilize that for, let's say, a snatch or a jerk or something along those lines, or if I was noticing when you're doing those movements, you're just not getting the motion that you need, all right? A couple other thoughts here. So the areas that can potentially limit your overhead mobility, the most obvious one is generally the thoracic spine or upper back. So it's pretty easy to see if I have a really bent forward posture here and I try to bring my arms overhead, I can't get fully overhead, right? If I get a little more upright from my thoracic spine, all of a sudden my arms go ahead, no problem, all right? The next thing that generally limits range of motion are going to be, one, the lats and the teres major, all right, which sit right in this area, and two, the pecs. The thing I like to get people thinking about a bit are which muscles may limit certain positions. So if I'm snatching and I have a wide grip, if you think about the angle of the pec fibers, they go here, right? They don't necessarily go straight up and down. So if you have someone in a straight up and down position like a jerk, right, or you're swinging this way, the pecs tend not to limit the motion as much as the lats, okay? But if you're a little bit wider in this position here, now the pecs are gonna be a little bit more stretched. So if people are limited in, let's say, a snatch, a lot of times the pecs are more limiting, and if they're limited strictly overhead, a lot of times it is the lats and the teres major, although that can be a little bit different depending on the individual.
So this is interesting, Dan, because based on that and based on what the individual sport is, it might make sense to do the screen the way we did it with thumbs together, but then also to do it from that wider grip. Because you might see, well, if they bring their fingers, 6 inches apart, they get up overhead and everything's cleared up fine. And for most pressing exercises, that's going to be okay. But you might also see, if you have an Olympic weightlifter and they're going to be in a wider position, you do the screen out to the side and you start to see different things flesh out. Like maybe they fall into more internal rotation than we'd like and things. So you can kind of divide and conquer and figure out what things are specific to that individual versus just sticking with the strict test.
Like it, man. Like it. Do you want to go over thoracic spine assessment?
Yeah. Why don't you break it out for me?
Okay, cool. So one of the things that's important that Kiefer was alluding to is if we're losing range of motion, sometimes we'll go into a little bit of internal rotation, okay? So if I don't have good motion from my thoracic spine, it's going to force extra motion from the shoulder. Sometimes that lends to problems, all right? So really quick and easy screen. Kiefer, let's go onto your stomach here.
Okay.
Here we're going to do what's called a prone press up. So basically just getting onto your elbows here, good, and pressing up but trying to relax your spine as much as you can and eyes straight ahead. Good. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my fingers and just go along the contour of the spine, feeling on, they're called spinous process. And I'll get an idea of whether or not he's rounded still, okay? In this position, gravity is supposed to be helping Kiefer. So if he has a very mobile spine, he should have a nice gradual slope up from the lower back to the head. If I start feeling along here, Kiefer's actually looking pretty good, but from here to here, still a little bit flexed, all right? And what you'll find is a lot of individuals have a ton of motion here, right? And some people have very little motion here. So if you start to screen it out, you can start to say, okay, does this person need thoracic spine mobility? Does this person need pec mobility? Does this person need lat mobility? And you can apply the right intervention for that person. Yeah. Cool. Sound good, man?
So what about mobility drills? So what would we do if you're going to break this out? What would be your couple of go-to things? I know we're not going to go over everything, but give me a couple that could help people get into a better overhead position.
You got it. So I'm a big fan of multimodal approach. I like to use all the techniques that we know are beneficial from a mobility standpoint. So usually that means I'm doing a little bit of foam rolling, I'm doing a little bit of stretching. I'm also trying to actively work into those ranges of motion. I'm a big fan of eccentrics as well. So usually I use a combination of different drills.
Okay.
Go through a few?
Let's do them.
Boom. Okay. Do you want to show a little lat foam rolling here?
Sure, let's do it, man.
Super basic, super easy. A couple of things to keep in mind are where the lats actually attach. The lats are going to attach from the armpit region up here on the upper arm bone here, called your humerus, and they go all the way down to your spine, okay? So in the back position here. So Kiefer's just going to roll along there. Keep in mind that the ribs are not always the nicest place to roll over top of, so if you're getting a bunch of pain, then I'll probably stop. The other thing I like to think about is rolling in 3D. So making sure you start with the shoulders stacked on top of one another, but then also bringing the shoulder forward some, and then also bringing the shoulder back a little bit. That way you're hitting the muscle from all different angles to make sure you're hitting all those fibers really well. That making sense there?
I like it.
Excellent. You want to do a little lat stretch next?
Sure.
Okay. Next thing we'll do is we utilize this bench and we'll get the PVC. We'll come right over here. So first I want to explain a little bit about the lats. The lats, like I said, attach from the humerus bone up here down to lower back. So when I round my back aggressively, I'm stretching my lats, and that's the reason why we do that, okay? The second thing we'll do is we'll make sure that the elbows are not going really wide, okay? Because the lats are an internal rotator. If I force them into external rotation by getting my elbows close and hands out wider, I'm stretching the lat from the shoulder. And the last little bit is we're going to round and sit backwards because when I try to flex my shoulder, I'm also going to stretch the lats some more. So yep, nice aggressive round here, very good. And you can see as Kiefer gets to the very bottom range of motion, he actually starts to extend a little bit from his spine, and that's just because he's fully shortened his lats. And at this point, they're starting to extend his spine. So a lot of times we can go back and forth with this drill. We can hang out there for 30 seconds or so, just really trying to mobilize the lats here, right? Making sense there, Keith?
That one feels good.
Awesome.
So
go ahead.
So on the mobility end, those are a couple basic things we can do, right? And if you want to get a little bit more advanced or specific, you know, maybe it's time to seek out a coach for that.
Yep.
The other end of the spectrum are the people that do this initial screen, they crush it, they get to the wall, but for some reason they're still struggling to get into a good overhead position, right?
Yep.
So these are the people that we see. It's not that mobility that's an issue, it's kind of their strength or their motor control that's more of an issue. And maybe that's, you know, just general weakness. Maybe it's because they've trained a bad pattern for a long time. So that's the other side of things that we try to work on a lot, right? So for me, when we do that stuff, first thing that I try to look at is what's their trunk or their core control like, right? So instead of going all the way into an overhead position for stuff, what we'll do a lot of times is we go to a push-up position or a table plank or a bear crawl position, whatever people want to call it, and we'll start to work on reaching from there so we can work on good scapular control, good strength from that position. So why don't you set up, go into a bear crawl position for me, Dan.
All right, let's do it.
And so what we see here, if you imagine Dan's position here, maybe it's, if you flip him up on his side, it's like he's standing, right? So we've got good trunk control here. He's in a nice neutral position. And then from here, what we're going to start to work on is him actually trying to reach his hands through the ground to create a good active shoulder position where the shoulder blade's forced to protract. And as we go, what we would start to do is we do maybe something like we call a reverse crawl, right? So Dan doesn't have a lot of space here, but if you could imagine, Dan's gonna take 1 or 2 steps backwards. And each time he steps, we start to get a little bit more upward rotation, a little bit of the motion that we want for a good, strong overhead position. So it's not super specific to the overhead, but we find that this starting position is something that a lot of people that don't have the strength to get overhead really lack, and that's where they start to lose control, and maybe they compensate with, flaring the ribs, or they get a weird elbow position on the way up. From there, the second one is we get a little bit more specific, is we do what we call like a kneeling landmine press, right? So I'll take Dan now, and again, we're changing position from the typical standing posture, right? And we're gonna bring one leg forward. And from here, it's really hard for Dan to fall out of position. He's in this kneeling position. It's really easy to work on anterior core control. He's gonna stay nice and stable here, and then as he presses this bar away from his body, he's gonna think of actively pushing himself back, drive that bar up in front of him. Good, and get to an almost overhead position, right? Why don't you switch arms for us, Dan? I wanna show one more thing. So now, as you can see, as he does another press, we start to get even more protraction, upward rotation of the shoulder. He's got a good straight line, and we have no compensation from the ribs or from the head as we go there, right? So this is an awesome strength exercise that a lot of people that are used to barbell sports don't do, because they skip right over to barbell overhead pressing or other bilateral variations, right? The third thing that we do to get even a little bit more specific, if you're still struggling, or you do a pretty good job overhead, but you just need a little bit more control, is we'll do a little bit of bottoms up pressing. Right? So we like to do it from the same position. We'll stay kneeling. We'll give somebody a light kettlebell. Now if we really want to challenge them and see how they can control that overhead position, we'll go ahead, keep the kettlebell upside down. We'll have them press nice and slowly right up into overhead position. And this is an awesome way to flesh out at what point they start to struggle, but also to really slow them down and teach them to own positions of the movement. Especially maybe if they're a weightlifter, maybe they're doing a lot of push pressing, a lot of jerking, but they're not doing much strict pressing. So this bottom half of the motion, having to really control the press all the way up through, can be an awesome exercise to work on that stability as an accessory to the stuff you're already doing. What do you think, Dan?
I like it, man. I think that's a super important point. So mobility is obviously important, and you need to make sure you're screening out and mobilizing the people that have problems, but you're gonna find a huge chunk of people that are going to have poor positions just because they're not strong enough to be there, they're not practiced there, or because they've just built bad habits.
Sure.
The last little thing I will say is that when someone has a mobility problem and you end up correcting that, you still have to think, this person has been really strong in this position for years potentially. Just because we mobilize the joint doesn't mean they're naturally going to use all that range of motion. So one, we have to get strong in those positions, like we just showed you, but the other part is that you have to actively cue that athlete, make sure you use that position, right? And the other part is you might have to decrease the load a little bit for a while they're getting stronger.
And I think that's a big reason why I like the approach that we take, is that there's no reason, whether you fall on one end or the other end of the spectrum, that you can't incorporate a little bit of soft tissue work, a little bit of these mobility drills, and some of this, crawling and landmine pressing or single arm pressing variations to just build up a good base and foundation for things.
I agree. Kiefer has really strong knees from all the half kneeling. My knees are actually hurting a little bit here. I need to work on my knee tolerance. So that's pretty much it.
You got anything else for him?
That's it. Yeah.
All right, guys, thank you so much. If you have questions or you have things you want us to go over in the future, make sure you drop a comment below. And as always, share this with friends if you think somebody can benefit from it.